Great. Many thanks, Nick, and good morning, everybody. We have a session now which actually is very closely linked to the preceding discussion, I think, namely the challenge of decarbonising the heavy industry or heavy transportation sector. And I think we've got an excellent panel that is going to consider this with us this morning. And before I invite them to join me up here on stage, let me just frame how we see this challenge and how we're going to consider it this morning. Logistics and mass transportation are very heavily reliant at present on fossil fuels and oil in particular, and account for about 20% of energy and process-related CO2 emissions. They have, on the other hand, been to some extent a neglected area of attention and public policy. And this is clearly a major challenge from an international and global perspective if we're going to achieve climate neutrality, net zero emissions, whether that is in Europe or indeed globally by mid-century. At the same time, global transport energy use is perhaps forecast to grow by up to 75% over the coming 30 years. So there is a question over how we're able to reconcile these two challenges, the greater energy use that may come from heavy transportation and the challenge of climate neutrality. So we have a number of questions, obviously, from that point of view that we need to address. What are the alternative technologies and low-carbon fuels that are currently available that we should be deploying at greater speed? What emerging technologies do we need to invest in more to develop greater innovation in order to clean up and decarbonize heavy transportation? What are the innovation requirements that we have for those? What is industry doing at present about this? And in particular, what are the policy frameworks that we need to enable this systems transformation of heavy transportation to accelerate in the short term? As we've just heard from the Minister, this is a challenge that we face today rather than tomorrow. So these broad questions we're going to address, and with that I'd like to introduce the four people who are going to consider this with me and invite you one by one to come and take the stage. The first is Paulus Tangjinjala, Commissioner from the Indonesian Biofuels Producers Association. Welcome onto the stage. The second is Her Excellency Dr. Yasmin Fouad, Minister of Environment for the Arab Republic of Egypt. Welcome, Minister. The third is Jared Blumenfeld, Secretary for Environment Protection of the California State Government. Welcome, Jared. And fourth, we have Angie Ferrang-Thibault, who is the Director of Collaborative Initiatives, Transport and Logistics for BSR. So welcome to you as well. So we have a limited amount of time, and I know the Minister has to leave at 11:15, so we'll make sure we give you a good chance to intervene before we break up. We're going to tackle a number of questions, but maybe if we run from left to right, first of all. But the first, briefly, is why you see it as so critically important to decarbonize heavy transportation systems from your perspective. So maybe we start with you, Paulus.
Oh, thank you. I'm representing the Indonesian Biofuel Producer Association. So years before the Paris Agreement, Indonesian government started to have the biofuel mandatory to using biodiesel 5% at the time in 2006. And now we are implementing the biodiesel 20% mandatory. And after the performance and road test has been done almost 9 months with a positive result, we are in the final stage to implement the B30 mandatory next year. So it is the first and a pioneer in the world. And since the end of last month, we are in the implementation phase trial of B30 in several areas in Indonesia. January, we will start to implement B30 entirely. And this is the remarkable stage, not only for the biodiesel itself, but the seriousness and courageousness of Indonesian government. This is the important thing, to implement B30 for the sake of the sustainability, then you're asking. And then the feedstock As you know that we have abundance of the palm oil, this wonderful vegetable oil crop is very high productivity. If you compare to rapeseed, for instance, rapeseeds need 4 or 6 times land area to produce the same volume if you compare to palm oil. And soy oil needs 8 times if you compare to palm oil. So it means that palm oil is incomparable productivity and more sustainable. And as all of us understood, the 3 main factors of sustainability, it is environment, social, and economic impact. The biodiesel program in Indonesia proves supporting the SDGs, of course. Our people afford to use the biodiesel and clean energy. To do it, of course, we form the system and mechanism by the government, and then the biodiesel economically viable to produce and to be used by the Indonesian people. In the last 10 years, biodiesel program also participated to affiliate the poverties and supporting the job creation. About the 480,000 people needed in the upstream activity, and then of course the smallholder income will raise. And greenhouse gas emission reduced significantly. This year we projected that we could reduce 16 million tons CO2 equivalent. It means that 15% less if you compare to use all the diesel fuels. And next year we're hoping that 26 million tons CO2 equivalent reduced, and then 20% saving from the diesel fuel emission. So as a biofuel producer, we really appreciate indeed to our government who gets far ahead to reduce the emission. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So that's a very clear perspective of an alternative fuel, which we see in progress and developing rapidly. Minister, maybe we can turn to you now and a perspective from your country of the challenge and also what your response is to this particular one.
Thank you very much. It's really a very important topic that we're talking about. Let me just give one key message on the why that you have mentioned on decarbonizing the heavy transport. The transport sector is one of the heaviest sector for the emissions of the greenhouse gases. And what was happening in the world in the last 5 to 6 years of the expansion of the renewable energy technologies is a driving force to look further into expanding the sustainable transport and the e-mobility part, including everything of the infrastructure, the ability of using the new technologies related to the renewable, the cost of the renewable energies, and so forth. So we can say that the floor is now ready with a sector that emits a lot and can help a lot in reducing the greenhouse gases in a very short time. In Egypt, we have been struggling with that renewable energy issue for a good of 5 to 6 years of striving and struggling with the cut of electricity. It was all over the country, and it was not easy to start on the renewable energy. We had to go into a policy framework of a feed-in tariff. We had to go into a large package of finance. We had to have guarantees for the private sector in order to engage in the first batch of the projects. And this, in the first place, needed a political commitment, a high political commitment to do so. We were able to do so because we had a president who believed that we need to do this transformation and we need to do that change. That was a time when we were facing the problem of the electricity. But now, because of the belief that we need to have this transformation in both the old and the new cities, just very quick example on what Egypt is doing in the transformation to the sustainable transport. One very first part is trying to change all our public transport system to e-mobility and to CNG. And working on that would mean that we will need a package of policies enabling environment. We will need a very strong infrastructure, and we need manufacturing and technology transfer. We worked on that parallel as different line ministries, Ministry of Transport, together with some other line ministries for the manufacturing, the Ministry of Industry, and the Ministry of Environment was doing the role of converting the package into the economic part. When we're talking about the air pollution and starting to the reduction of the greenhouse gases for the normal citizen, In fact, this does not mean so much. It only means a lot when you start linking the cost of environmental degradation, the air pollution, the reduction of the greenhouse gases to their house, and how much that will let them spend. The other part, how much jobs would be generated. For the new cities, like the new administrative capital, we're working on the old cities in changing the buses. We're working on the reduction for the transfer of the public transport with the taxes, okay, with the free taxes. We're working on a very important part with the decision, a very bold decision from the cabinet. In all the cars that is above 20 years will not have their license anymore. And we are replacing the old taxes. That for the old cities like Cairo and Greater Cairo, that is already packed. But for the new cities, we're planning them more smartly. We're planning them with an e-mobility train, the monorail, that will convert and will connect the people from the old city to the new capital. As a government, we're all passing that. So the challenges are a lot. There are institutional challenges to link all of us together and include the private sector and see the added value and leverage the private sector financing the transport sector. There is technical part on the manufacturing and depending on how you can replicate and upscale that. And there is also financial challenges. But if you have a real political commitment and a plan for a whole transformation system at the national level in different areas, energy, transport, waste management, to have a new reform, I think that would work out very easily. Thank you.
Fantastic, thank you. So a clear indication that an infrastructure and integrated approach is essential, certainly from a mass transportation perspective. Jared, so the same question for you. Why is this so important for you from your perspective? And what are you starting to do about it in California?
So thanks, Martin. It's amazing that, these events, part of the beauty of them is to find out how much you have in common. We might not have seen before the commonality between Egypt and California, but there's a lot. So, yeah. So part of California's challenge when we think about greenhouse gas reductions, we have a renewable portfolio standard to get to carbon neutrality within electricity by 2045. We have zero emission vehicle mandates when it comes to passenger vehicles. We have building standards. When you look at the whole lay of the land of what we need to do to get to our 2040 goals, which are very ambitious, freight and goods movement, it plays a very significant role. So about 40% of all our greenhouse gas emissions going forward that we need to curb are in the transportation sector. When you look at California, most people don't think of goods movement and freight and warehousing as a large component of what we do, but literally trillions of dollars come through the ports in LA and Long Beach. Those produce significant amount of jobs and revenue for the state. And those million trucks that are on the road in California, a million, produce a significant amount of diesel particulate matter. So it's both a health and a immediate kind of greenhouse gas reduction strategy of ours to tackle that sector. Our economy in the United States is largely based on household consumption. Household consumption is largely based on imports from Asia. And so our economy is really, really dependent on things moving around the state. When you think about kind of adding on to our challenges, people now want it delivered next day in a box by itself. So this kind of immediacy of consumerism is also a big challenge of ours. So the way we're thinking about it is really to follow what we did in passenger vehicles. So tomorrow at the Air Resources Board in California, they're looking at a mandate for 2024 to set zero emission vehicle standards for the heavy duty sector. I think one of the big things that we've learned in our long history when it comes to clean air regulation is we're very, very bad at picking winners and losers. Like 1 year it's going to be LNG, then it's going to be CNG, then it's going to be hydrogen, then it's going to be electric. Our goal is not to tell you what you should be doing, but we want to tell you where we want to go together. Incentives have played a large role, up to $300,000 per vehicle. We have a very significant labor issue in the United States, and I think globally, that attaches to this and relates to the Swedish deputy minister's point, which is there's going to be a lot of social dislocation. So, not only are we moving towards zero-emission vehicles, but we're also moving towards autonomous vehicles. And I think if you talk to truck drivers in the United States, they're very, very fearful that when we're talking about clean vehicles, we're talking about automation, and automation means losing jobs. So we need to decouple those two things in the short term. If we move forward with automation as being intrinsically linked to zero-emission vehicles, we'll have some big social dislocation issues. So we can talk more later about kind of how we're doing that, but this is a very big sector, and it's the last one being tackled in California, so it's the most complicated for us to deal with.
Yeah, great. Well, I think that gives a clear indication of the complexity, the systems challenges that we face when we're trying to tackle this issue, and the relationship between other adjacent issues, whether they are social, public health, or related, which need to be tackled together. So finally, we're going to turn to Angie, and maybe a perspective from business, essentially, both with regards to why this is such a significant and serious challenge, but also some initial thinking on the what we should do about it, what we are doing about it.
Thank you, and I'll come to lots of examples as we go through. But firstly, really great to see that heavy transport's now on the agenda, especially on the freight movement side. I think all the panelists recognize that, and from a business perspective as well as a policy perspective, we're really seeing more recognition that freight transport is massively significant. It needs some very specific thinking about that. I work with companies, and we work with companies on decarbonizing freight movements. That's both on the transport company side, but also on big brands. How can they actually influence emissions reductions through their supply chains? And this is a huge part of the solution, because it's a commercial industry. So if we have the right incentives in place, this could shift. And I think that's a really important message that will come through with examples later. I'd say what three big reasons why we need to decarbonize heavy transport now, and they've been addressed really, is obviously this is increasing. We are seeing an increasing demand of freight, all this on-time delivery, all of those things is just more and more. By 2050, we're looking at a 2 times emissions increase and more in some projections. Secondly, it's been identified by the Energy Transitions Commission and others that this is one of the hardest sectors to abate. Shipping, aviation, heavy road trucking, they're very, very complex. Two main reasons, I would say. First is on the asset life cycle side. Once we start looking at if we want zero emission vessels, the asset life cycle is 20 to 30 years. We really need to have new vessels, zero-emission vessels on the water, in the air by 2030 if we have any chance of reaching our 1.5-degree goals by 2050. Secondly, it's been mentioned, of course, but on the side of the solution, we need systems-level thinking. We look at the policies around transportation are very complicated, because you have your national policies, but then we need to look across borders about how do we do with international shipping and aviation. Obviously, ICAO and IMO are setting standards now, but that's outside of the Paris Accord. So there's a complication in terms of how we think about systems. Obviously, companies also have global supply chains. So solutions are there, but we need to think really like as an entire system across borders. And thirdly, I'll just say it's becoming more and more urgent. We look at climate change as something in the future, but actually we're seeing infrastructure impacting freight movement, the efficiency of freight movement, the cost of freight movement more and more. DHR released a study just last week that showed that low rain levels in the Panama Canal made actually very significant delays and increased costs for actually moving raw materials to production sites. So we're really seeing those impacts, and it's going to take a lot to think about adaptation and route planning in the future.
Great, thank you. Well, picking up on that point about urgency, maybe we could run across each of you for a view of where you see the biggest opportunity for rapid progress in this area, and what we should be doing to promote that, particularly given what you said about international collaboration. These are issues which are clearly dependent on a high degree of international collaboration, amongst other things. So maybe we could start with you, Paulus.
Yes. In Indonesia, we thought that the using the biodiesels is a very rapid way to reducing the emission. Why? First, of course, we have a lot of feedstock, right, in Indonesia, but palm oil. The second one, it is like Angie mentioned, is for the transportation. It is very heavy emission. It's same like in our everybody countries, right? So we need to cut of the emission as soon as possible, and also the economically, it is will be raise. I mean the smallholders, farmers' income. These are the two things for Indonesia are really concerned about that. And then also we could cut the import of the fossil fuel. This is for the Indonesian. That's why we think that it's very important to using the biofuel. But we need, of course, more cooperation with other countries, because why? In the future, the near future, we need to have advanced biofuels. So it's kind of like bioafter and then even biogasoline. We will make it from the palm oil. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Thank
Same
you.
question to you.
Thank you. I think we need to work on two tracks for that question on the international level. First of all, there is no in this part of the heavy transport, the one size that fits all. It's not there. So first of all, there should be, because Egypt started that actually 10 years ago, and the one that started that was the Ministry of Environment, under the climate change portfolio, and the Sustainable Transport Project waited with a package of public transport, of social surveys, of how can we introduce the bike, how can we start that in a culture, what would be the demand and the supply part. So internally, you need to do your own exercise and not try to have a copy and paste. At the parallel level for the international part, after you do your own internal exercise, start looking at the multilateral funds and the MDBs, and how can we generate a public-private partnership modality that works best within the country, because that is very important. It's not the finance all that will be there, and the private sector working on that. But for an example, Egypt started that by a big chunk of finance from the different companies all around the world. But we're now working on a package of small and medium enterprises through one of the MDBs to encourage the youth to work in that area, in the transport, as well as working with the universities for generation of more ideas and R&D part. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Jared.
I mean, luckily around the world, from Shanghai to Rotterdam to ports around the world, there's really great examples that we're stealing from to try and make our ports zero emissions. So that's from making sure that foreign flag vessels that come into the United States have the ability to hook up to shore power, all the way through looking at, to Angie's point, this is a very complex logistical set of arrangements. But the first thing for us is really fuel switching. How do we think about whether it's renewable biodiesel or renewable diesel itself, how we're thinking about with the current fleet of vehicles, given that they last in the economy for so long, how do we help those folks transition? And then, for the larger fleets, how we're moving them towards cleaner fuels. One of the examples that I love to give is around efficiency. So there's a huge amount of efficiency we can get in the system. Walmart had a campaign to reduce packaging by 5% over a 10-year period. By doing that, they took 150,000 trucks off the street. So just reducing the size of the package, you can get the same economic benefit to the end customer. And then for the very maybe distant future, this is kind of really far out there, I think 20 years from now, people will be 3D printing at home. It won't need to be manufactured in a foreign country and shipped over and moved through this whole network. So understanding kind of what will or won't happen in people's homes that's different to today, so that we can avoid some shipping in the first place.
Great. That shows the innovation potential that we need to be aware of across the economy as much as in transport, obviously. So, Angie, the same question to you, but maybe as many examples as you might want to point to that you're aware of.
Yeah. I mean, I know we say it's one of the hardest to abate, but we are now also seeing really good examples of what can be done. And especially, I think, from a business perspective, there's decarbonisation roadmaps. They could be in more detail, but we've got good case studies, so don't reinvent the wheel. And I do agree that it's a sort of a two-level approach. As a company, there's a series of things that could happen when looking at your own fleets, Some of them are easier than others. And then there's another level, which is how do you collaborate and how do you ensure your supply chain really makes the commitments to reduce as well. And then the third, of course, is then engaging in public policy. But if I just stick with the first two, so it's been mentioned, but efficiency, I think there's a real opportunity to improve the efficiency of current fleets, optimizing routes, optimizing load capacity. We see hundreds of examples of how this is possible with a really short return on investment time. There may be an upfront cost, which is what we need to think about with incentives, but several company examples of how they've been able to reduce energy consumption by 30 to 50% by just changing aerodynamics, fuel loads, sharing load capacity, etc. on vehicles. Fuel switch, biofuels, other alternative fuels, obviously a big area, and that's where we also need to see collaboration in the value chain to actually pilot these opportunities and then set them to scale. This year we saw some incredibly exciting pilot projects between CMA CGM, IKEA, between Maersk and some of the big Dutch shippers, piloting biofuels on big ocean-going vessels. And the opportunity of doing that was twofold. One was really to see that shippers are really wanting to lead on collaborating on solutions. Let's test, let's try to co-invest and see what we can do. And the second thing was, like, just from an operational perspective, we do need to test whether these fuels can run big ships and biofuels on planes, etc. And actually having the whole value chain coming together to test that, co-invest in it, is going to help us scale it. Other things companies should be doing is really around their own business planning. I think it's right. In the future we may get 3D printing, but in the meantime, let's think about how can you manufacture goods closer to market. How could they partner with other companies to share trucks, to share, make sure the load is fuller. And I think modal shift isn't always the answer, but it has to be part of a package of solutions that companies think about. And last thing I'll just say on this is as well as the collaboration on testing decarbonization solutions, big brands have a big role to play in ensuring that environmental criteria is a key part of their procurement decisions. It was mentioned earlier today, but really making sure that having certain specifications in place with the suppliers is what big container companies and airlines and others need to have in their back pocket to say we need to invest in more energy efficiency and decarbonized solutions because our customers need us to. And that's where a massive driver that we need to make sure is working.
Great, thank you. Yasmin, I know that you need to leave, so I just wanted to give you a chance to offer one last comment or wish that you might take away.
Nothing more than I think that it's a high time that we should act now. The floor is ready. We have the renewable energies technology that can support that, but we need to collaboratively have that spirit of cooperation and collaboration and giving more to the world than taking from the world. Thank you.
Great, many thanks indeed. Nick, at what point do we get the answers to the question that you posed? And
good point, Martin. It's ready to go.
Maybe we can just have a quick look at that before we...
You've been reading my mind. Can we do that?
Right, very good. That's
there it is. Do you want me to read it, or
yes,
can you read it?
Yes, if you can read it.
All right. What is the best alternative right now for freight shipping and commercial air travel? Biofuels, we've just been hearing about that, 34%. Hydrogen, 21%. Stop transporting goods, 21%. Important that. Electrification, 18%. Petroleum, 3%. 38 of you have actually contributed. Over to you.
Very good. Well, on that basis, then, I guess, Paulus, you must be quite reassured by that response. What, given that enthusiasm, do you see as the most important thing that is lacking to enable this to happen more quickly and in an overall sustainable way? One of the challenges, as we've heard, is to make sure that we develop these technologies and these solutions without causing unintended side effects. So what do you see as the most important next step for us?
Yeah. One thing that believe that this, the idea that the best one is using the biofuel, of course, right? But of course, we need to produce more and more sustainable for using the biofuel. Second one, we try hard to have them second generation, what so-called second generation, next generation of biofuel makes us better and better. And like Engi mentioned, we have to make a trial. For instance, for B30, we make a trial performance and road test is about for 50,000 kilometers, right? For 9 months. In 1 month, together with the engine manufacturers and then the car manufacturers, we working together. And also the next, soon we will make a trial for the railways. And then also to the shipping companies also, we make a trial, of course.
Great. Jared, same question to you. What is lacking at the moment, and what do we therefore need to focus on as a priority right now?
I think the first thing that's lacking is ambition, just describing where we want to go and how we want to get there in broad terms in this sector. As Angie mentioned, this has kind of been left to the end. It is very complex, and so laying out a clear framework, both at the national and subnational and even international level of where we want to go, and the important role that this plays, namely, this is a huge economic engine for many, many regions, so we can't have disruption. At the same time, we need to have innovation, and that innovation often, has impacts for the industries that have invested a lot in fossil fuel based technology. So for us, it's the roadmap. It's coming up with a collaborative partnership that we understand what incentives government needs, like where do we need them exactly, how do we need to push them, and then really making sure that we have that implementation. One of the big things that we focus on in California is actually air quality issues and trucks from other states. So we now have a smog check program that looks at tailpipe emissions for vehicles. Bizarrely, for instance, this kind of shows how far behind we are. That's existed for decades in California and many states when it comes to passenger vehicles. This is the first year that we've put a smoke check for trucks. So I think it's realizing that the emissions today are causing huge inequitable health disparities for communities along freight corridors. And so we certainly spend a lot of time understanding that really prioritizes this as opposed to many other reduction strategies. Communities that live on these, whether it's rail or trucks or next to ports or airports, in the United States are really saying we need this change now, not in 10 years, not to meet these 2050 targets, but now to deal with asthma and cancer and other risks.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, same question to you, Angie.
Yeah.
What's the most important thing we have to do now, and what is lacking? What should we focus on?
I mean, I just to say, I think that the co-benefits piece is so critical, and it's so important for cities and regions and government in particular. So really hope that this is a message that can come through. I mean, for me, I think I very much agree. It's targets, ambition. We've got to actually raise the ambition and be much clearer about what are my targets, from a company's perspective, from a country's perspective, and then innovators come in and they fill some gaps. We've got, as I mentioned before, a suite of solutions that can be implemented. Now it's about incentivizing that implementation process. On the case of targets, I just want to mention two things. For companies, I think we've seen some progress. Over 700 companies have now set science-based targets. And through that process, a lot more multinationals are realizing that freight transport can be up to 30% of their Scope 3 emissions. So now they come to us and say, what can we do about this? What should we do about this? And there are programs. There is the Clean Cargo Working Group. There is a number of different initiatives where they can get the data they need. They can influence their procurement process to get suppliers to do more. They can be part of that decarbonization solution. But by them setting a target, it really puts their suppliers on alert, and that gets innovators to come in. I mean, when Maersk set their zero emissions by 2050 target, that's like, they don't know how they're going to achieve that gap, but now there's a signal that innovators should come into heavy transport, not just look at some of the other sectors. Yeah. I'd also say the same for countries, in the sense that I read something earlier this week that in the NDCs, about 80% of NDCs have mentioned transport. 60% of them have actual measures behind that, but only 10% of them actually set emissions reduction targets. And so once we start to actually really bring that into the policy side, there can be this collaboration on what are we trying to reduce and by when. And for us, I think we see by 2050, we need to have decarbonized transportation on the freight side. And if we can all go for that same aim and have some milestones in between, like zero emission vessels by 2030, we have a shot at this.
Okay, great. Well, clearly targets are going to be very important here. But just to come back on that last point, are there signs that you see from the business community that they are seeing opportunity from that transition and that rapid change? Because as you said, there will be some who find that transition very difficult. Are you seeing others who are going to be making much of the opportunity?
I mean, yes, I think so. I think there is opportunity, but there is also upfront cost, and there's a level playing field issue. And I think that's why it's very important to have, you know, bold, ambitious targets. Sorry, from a policy perspective, make sure that they understand what the operating environment is, and then more people are going to basically try to look at those solutions. We are seeing you know, significant emissions reductions. We're seeing a lot more multinationals coming on board to say we will set goals. I think through the EV100 initiative, over 60 multinationals have now said that by 2050 they will have zero emissions or electric vehicles. Sorry, that's a solution. But then it's just a complex environment. There's no one-size-fits-all solution, as has been said. If we just look at the road freight sector, for example, where 62% of the emissions come from, only 12% of that is in urban environments. So electric vehicles isn't always going to be the solution. What we need to look at the rural environments for that. So that's where this sort of country planning and working in collaboration with business is key to identify what solution is going to fit where and what incentive do you need to make sure that we can ensure that we don't create barriers for first movers.
Okay, great. So I'm going to look at Nick and check, because I know that we're up against the clock here. Do we? Oh, we do have still 4 minutes. Do we have time to take questions?
I'm told
in that
there are a lot
case?
of questions about biofuels. Angie, would you like to just give them to me now? Because I'll give them to Martin, if I may.
Or if you
Sorry,
have them
I'm sending
directly,
for the
Nick,
What?
you can ask the question, and then maybe we'll
All
post
right.
them to
Would
our
you mind?
colleagues. Absolutely.
Yeah.
We'll be more efficient in time that way.
What about the impacts of palm oil on deforestation? How many places biofuels have replaced native forests? Nobody is talking about stakeholder engagement. Just transition absolutely requires it. Are any of your entities working to ensure people's voices are heard? Maybe that last one for the moment.
Okay, great. So maybe the first question I think you could take, Paulus, and then the points about stakeholder participation, people's engagement, we'll turn to the
Yes,
second.
thank you. This is a really hot issues, right? The palm oil, deforestation. Actually, the palm oil plantation, and they have no relation with the deforestation, actually. Because why? The palm oil came to Indonesia, and then they started to make a plantation 100 years ago, starting by whom? By European people, right? Companies from European. And we now developing all the palm oil. And in the 70s, Indonesian really cut down a lot of the forests at the time. Why? Because we need the money. At the time, 70s, after the communist coup failed. And then we cut the forests for the timber, making the household, everything, and we exporting to Europe also, right? And then when, after 10 years, no forest at the time, the World Bank came to Indonesia. Why don't you let them, grow something? And we grew, the rubbers and other things, including the palm oil. So after 10 years. So today, only 5% of our total land area for the palm oil cut from the forest. It's very, very small, actually. And then the forest in Indonesia is almost now 50% of our land, actually. And then the palm oil takes only 6% of our land. It's very, very small, actually. Okay. It is for the palm oil. And then we making more and more sustainable all the things. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I know it's a big issue, but we don't have much time. So we've got about a minute for each of you to give a response to the question of people's involvement, stakeholder participation, and so on that we had.
It's a great question, and it's absolutely essential. I mean, as complicated as these systems are, we're not including the public in discussion. So, for instance, just at the port of LA Long Beach, which is one of the largest ports in the world, the port community that lives around it has a very clear sense of what they want. The shipping companies themselves, the leaseholders all have different views. The city of LA has a different view. the OEMs that are trying to, push new technologies have their views themselves, and then you have the logistics companies, you have the cities that the communities go through, you have the air district that oversees their air quality issues, you have customs and border all the way through, the IMO dealing with vessel emissions. So in any particular context, if you short circuit that, you really jeopardize getting the result. So spend the time at the beginning to listen to the communities, understand the different stakeholders, and you'll get a much better integrated result.
Thank you. Angie, the final word is yours.
10 seconds. I think on the involving stakeholders, especially the public on the fuel side has been addressed. Just two things. Firstly, I think there's a lot more stakeholders that need to be also engaged in looking at the solutions. The finance sector, the energy sector, we need everybody around the table to look at what the solutions are for heavy transport. On the side of when we look at commodities, as an organisation, BSR, we are trying to engage all stakeholders through our collaborative initiatives. We have started new ones on commodities, specifically looking at biofuels and palm oil. So I just encourage you to look into that further and see where we could be collaborating more and getting more voices at the table through some of these initiatives.
Great. And with that, I'm afraid we're going to have to wrap it up. I think we've obviously given attention to this issue now, and that was objective number one, I think, of today's discussion, and obviously started to come up with some of the ideas, the solutions, what we need to do immediately to start making rapid progress on this. So thank you to each of you for joining us. Thank you to all of you for your participation in the poll and your questions. And I think now, Nick, it's a coffee break. Is that right?
Martin, yes, just sit there for the moment.